Patricia, that goes by Pat as well. Patricia Escalante, she's from the IMF. She's a data scientist there. And then we're going to have Domenico, who's a senior economist at UNHCR, the Joint Data Center. I think you all know him. And so we're going to start with this presentation, and then we are going to move to a panel, and I'll introduce our panelists after these two presentations. So, Pat, I think you're going to be going first. Thanks. We have about 7 to 8. Okay.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pat Escalante. I'm a data scientist for the Statistics Department of the IMF, and I'm here today to discuss the fund's Forced Displacement Initiative that we did in collaboration with the UNHCR. So to get started, I'm going to start with a statistic from our partner. At the end of 2023, an estimated 117 million people were forcibly displaced. This staggering number is a humanitarian crisis. But to the IMF, this number could also signify a multifaceted macroeconomic challenge. So to address this challenge, here are some key areas of involvement. First, the fund can provide macroeconomic analysis and policy advice by identifying the impacts of forced displacement on host and origin countries, looking at both the cost and benefits. We can also conduct surveillance considering resilience, inclusive growth, and fiscal implications, and also considering the impacts on the balance of payments. Second, through capacity building and technical assistance, the IMF can emphasize the importance of data collection, like when working with country authorities, for example, to inform policy decisions. This could also support countries in developing socio-economic integration and inclusive growth strategies. This is especially important for countries with protracted internal displacement and refugee spillovers. And last, the fund can collaborate and share knowledge with our partners by exchanging analytics, research, and lessons learned. And of course, we can also strengthen our partnerships with organizations such as the UNHCR and other local and regional entities. I would now like to highlight our partnership with the UNHCR as it's really central to this endeavor. While macroeconomic expertise is important in assessing the impact of forced displacement, this partnership really bridges macroeconomics and humanitarian expertise. In response to worsening forced displacement trends and their significant socio-economic and developmental implications, this partnership has gained significant relevance. This partnership has also deepened by the adoption of the fund's 2022 FCS strategy and the secondment of a UNHCR staff member, Ana Laura Sacco, into the IMF. So just let me highlight 2 key elements of this partnership. Ana Laura has become crucial in the part of the IMF work, joining IMF missions, for example, like those to Jordan. So this cooperation involves joint assessments of economic and humanitarian expertise in host countries. This will ensure that both are integrated into our discussions with governments and also program designs. And we've also learned from mission chiefs and country teams that they also receive questions on forced displacement from national authorities. But without the availability of this data, some of those questions can be left unanswered. And we also know in research and in policy, data availability could also mean inclusion. So this partnership has this partnership helped us also recognize that comprehensive data is really the foundation for the IMF to conduct robust, evidence-based analysis and provide sound policy advice. This is the same message that Monsieur Abduraouf mentioned yesterday, and we also wanted to highlight it here. So together with Ana Laura, we've identified an opportunity to institutionalize a strategy at the IMF to quantify the impact of forced displacement based on data. So together, we co-developed the IMF's forced displacement portal. This innovative platform gives staff access to the most pertinent data on forced displacement. Currently, the platform is only available internally at the IMF because we wanted to give staff the chance to thoroughly go through the portal and also give us comprehensive feedback. However, we're delighted to share that we have plans early next calendar year to go external. So just quickly, how did we build this portal? So as a data scientist, I began the process by conducting a comprehensive internal data gap analysis. And through this process, found that the resources and the data that we needed was not inside the fund. So it wasn't covered by the resources that we had. And we also weren't clear on external resources and which ones to point to. So this discovery led Ana Laura and I to form strategic partnerships with key external data providers, allowing us to fill the gaps that we had internally. So to build this portal, Ana Laura and I put together a diverse team of staff across the IMF. So this large team comprises of economists, data scientists, we have engineers, UX experts, designers, legal advisors, and even like data licensing experts. So this approach that we took really ensures that we had the right mix of skills to tackle this complex issue. And crucially, after forming this team, we engaged in multiple rounds of discussions with a wide range of stakeholders within the fund. So for example, we had discussions with the country teams of the top 10 host countries. We also had feedback discussions with staff from across 10 different departments and also different skill sets. So these could be economists, data experts, along with senior management from the fund. So after all of these iterative gathering, like data gathering, we identified 6 key categories that are particularly important to the IMF's work on forced displacement. And the following are the 6 categories. I'm just going to go through them very quickly. We have data on demographics, which includes age, education, and skills. This data would be important when we highlight, as Professor Leonard did yesterday, that these populations should be seen as assets. So as many are highly skilled and educated, so these are some indicators that could be used. Labor and household will give us data on work participation and living conditions. Law and policy, data to assess legal frameworks. Fiscal, to give us information on public expenditures such as education costs and cash transfers. We have financial data sets, which gives us data on the access to financial services. And lastly, we have supporting indicators. So supporting indicators are really non-traditional sources, such as satellite data, for example, or climate indices that aim to fill the gaps where official statistics are unavailable. Furthermore, it also holds forecasting indicators or predictive data that are important when we talk about prevention, which was also brought up yesterday. So altogether, we can ask a range of different questions now when we get, for example, questions from the national authorities or to the country teams. One example could be, in countries with large informal sectors, how can we assess the economic contributions of displaced persons? Or other questions across different topic areas such as climate, conflict, or research around FCS. So to fill these 6 categories, as I mentioned earlier, we did not have the resources internally. So we partnered with 23 key entities. So some of these include the UNHCR, the JDC, OECD, academic institution, privates, and others. Once we go external, we'll make that list available. So with the data that we gathered, we split them into 2, quantitative data and qualitative data. On the left-hand panel, you'll see an example of the page on fiscal indicators. So across all the 6 indicators, you have over 90 curated open source indicators for macroeconomic and financial analysis. We also have a country checker because we know data availability could be different across different countries and data sets. So we have a country checker. If you're only interested in looking at certain countries or regions, you can go into that. And we've also built interactive charts and dashboards to give an overview of these different data indicators and how they can work with each other. On the right-hand side is a preview of the qualitative data. So we have glossary reports, different toolkits and methodologies. Reports, for example, are published analysis and work using indicators on the quantitative data side to give our staff some examples on how to use certain indicators that they may not be as familiar with. So aside from the portal, here are some other recent fund products that Anna Laura in particular worked on. So we have the Article 4 consultation of Poland, we have the Jordan staff report, and the Rio for MCD, the Regional Economic Outlook for the Middle East and Central Asia Department. Yes, and here also some other analytical work that could direct your analysis. If you're interested, we'd be happy to share this later on. So yeah, lastly, we just want to point out that this work is really an opportunity for collaboration on collaboration analytics. As together, we can leverage the data to gain a better understanding of how country challenges can inform positive recommendation. But the work is also an invitation. As we expand the portal externally next year, we'll value and look to your experience and expertise in addressing the rest of the remaining data gaps, such as, for example, incorporating additional indicators and sources, while also increasing country coverage. So this is just the beginning of our work, especially now that Anna Laura has only been with us for a few years. We've already done so much. At least in the IMF, this is just the beginning. So we look forward to exploring ways to work together, and we want to thank the JDC for allowing us to share our work. We just launched this internally yesterday, and this is the first time we're sharing it publicly, so it's really exciting for us. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me and Anna Laura, and the rest of our team will also be, we'll showcase them next year as well once we go external. Thanks.
I hope you're going to put the slides available.
Good afternoon, everybody. While we wait for the slide to appear, let me get started by introducing myself. I'm Domenico Tabasso, senior economist at the JDC. And I want to start where Patricia left. I mean, Patricia spoke a lot about partnership, and this presentation, if you want, really is also about partnership. Partnership between a specific group of stakeholders. Partnership between researchers on the one hand, and practitioners and policymakers on the other. At the JDC, we've been working for quite a while now in designing products that can facilitate this collaboration. But so far, most of these products have been on existing research, leveraging on existing research. So, for example, we've designed data platforms, publications to make research more digestible to practitioners and policymakers. We have developed training for practitioners based on existing socioeconomic data. However, we now want to take a step ahead and facilitate the production of research with a clear operational relevance. Yes, Kristen. Can you hear me? I'm here to please you. You tell me what to do, I do it. Oh, I love moving when I talk. Thank you. So, I'll try not to move too much, otherwise the cameras will go nuts. So, we want to help the production of operationally relevant research. And that's because we've heard it loud and clear from researchers who, for example, I'm not going to name anyone, but I will indicate that there is room for bringing new research to the policymakers. And at the same time, we've heard from policymakers that sometimes this research that they get from researchers is not immediately usable. And so how can we actually think about facilitating this work? Well, the product that we would like to, that we're working on, that we're designing right now, we call it the marketplace. And it's a
open space, virtual space, in which we'd like to facilitate the meeting of researchers on the one hand, practitioners and policymakers on the other. In a very simplified version, because we are still in the design phase, one could think about this in an extremely simple platform in which any practitioner, policymaker in the need for research, for research skills, for evidence, could post their call in order to have an exchange with researchers, an exchange that is going to be public and transparent. We are designing this so that these research opportunities, which can take the form of collaboration, consultancies, call for papers, call for publication, and I can assure you that the moment there is a bit of money behind this, the researcher will be even more interested in this. All of this will be transparently posted there so that it doesn't reach only the usual suspect, if you want, or those who already have access to institutional opportunities, but can reach researchers all around the world and possibly facilitate collaborations among researchers all around the world to provide the best type of research that is operationally needed there. Now, as I said, this is an extremely simplified, we are designing, but these, can start by, we can start by putting there whatever is already existing on the website, we can consolidate and put it there, fine, easy, maybe time consuming, but not particularly complicated. But we want to go ahead. We want to really try and facilitate to a certain extent this meeting and this production. And therefore, we realize that this can only happen if there is a concrete interest by all parties involved. We call it a market, and a market only exists if there is a demand and there is a supply. So we need to stimulate this. Now, what we want to do is to make sure that these parties can meet. And to kickstart this, we're thinking about an in-person event to let this party meet and talk and start dialoguing and start thinking together, start brainstorming about what kind of opportunities are really there that we can then, again, transparently place there to start filling up our platform that will then go ahead in the months to come. So this is coming in the next weeks, months, once we recover from this conference. That's where where our effort is going to be, at least my effort and that of other colleagues in the JDC. But we will need your input, whether you're a researcher, a practitioner, a policymaker. This can only work because with your input. It's not a tool for the JDC, it's a tool for you. So we will require your input there to make it work. Now, it can take different shapes. You can have different type of contents there. As I said, we're in design phase, so suggestion, comments. Oops, sorry. Just want to show my email address is there. You can always reach out to me and give me your feedback. And I hope we'll be able to see you all at this in-person event. Stay tuned. We will let you know about it. Thank you.
That's exciting, right? We have a new market place, and then we have also a new dashboard of the IMF. So we've learned a lot, and it will be really exciting to see where both of these initiatives go. So let us move to the next part of our panel. And before we do that, let me introduce our distinguished panelists. So we have Luis Felipe López-Calva. On my right is the Global Director for the Poverty and Equity Global Practice at the World Bank. So really excited to have him here. And I have here also Elizabeth Tan, who's the Director of the Division of International Protection at UNHCR. And I think online we have Rose Oronje, who's the Director of Public Policy and Knowledge Translation, Head of the Kenya Office of the African Institute for Development Policy. Is Rose here?
Yes, I'm here.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks for joining. So my first question will be for you, Luis Felipe, as the Global Director of Poverty and Equity Global Practice. There's probably no better person than you to reflect. You're in an excellent position to discuss how the World Bank is mainstreaming forced displacement in its analysis and operations. And especially, I think the crowd here will be interested to hear how the World Bank is addressing barriers that link research and policy making. It could be in the poverty space, but obviously we're most interested also in the forced displacement space. So first question is to you.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the invitation to be in this conference and to be part of this panel. The first thing I will say is that the World Bank recently, after a long reflection and collective reflection with the board members, changed the mission statement. And now, as you know, we used to talk about the eradication of poverty and fostering shared prosperity. Now, the mission of the bank is summarized as ending poverty on a livable planet. I want to stress that the choice of livable planet is a deliberate attempt to include, of course, climatic challenges, but to talk to a broad definition, to bring a broader definition of what it means to have a livable planet, and that includes issues related to fragility, conflict, pandemics, and so on. So this is a very important element because in the livable planet idea of our mission, we explicitly bring the issue of fragility, conflict, and so on, and the impact it has on people. Okay, so from the very top, we are now including this concern very clearly. Second, we are, pushing for more partnerships to be more effective. So the idea is the World Bank can only be more effective if we partner with others. So I think the fact that we are strengthening and bringing this effort, this joint effort about for example, the joint data center with UNHCR is one example. I can mention other examples like the recent poverty assessment in Central African Republic that was also done in collaboration with UNHCR, but we're partnering also with others. So the first element is in order to bring the idea of how we work with these populations, forcibly displaced people, and I would argue also internally displaced people, is to be able to partner with others and understand a multidimensional perspective on the problem. The second element is we, particularly in our poverty practice, we are the interlocutors of the national statistical offices. So we systematically try to incorporate these populations in the national statistical systems. The most important and sustainable way to have policies that respond to these challenges is by actually having systematic collection of data on these populations. And that is why we really try to engage with the national statistical offices on this. And finally, we make an effort, and it's really interesting to see what is happening in other sister institutions at the IMF, and we have a conversation with them on this, is make it available. So last November, we published harmonized data for 10 countries in which we have a very rich set of indicators about forcibly displaced people. And I want to say that the main instrument we have, and with this I close this first intervention, is what we call the poverty. It used to be called the poverty assessments. Now they are called the poverty and equity assessments. These are systematic analysis that we do at country level, and that feeds into the dialogue in every specific context, fits into the dialogue and the operational priorities. for the bank. So what we're doing, and we have done this also in conversations with colleagues, for example, at the UN, and also on IDPs with the special advisor Robert Piper and so on, to bring the visibility with the data we generated, bring the visibility for these populations in our poverty and equity assessments, so that fits into the conversations with the countries in terms of the engagement. At the end, and with this I close, conceptually, the issue is how we go from humanitarian to development interventions. And this is basically where, as we understanding from the poverty perspective, is giving people back their agency. Fundamentally, having the capacity to give people back the control over their own lives. And that involves, precisely for us, that's the key bridge between humanitarian and development. And that can only be done effectively if we have good data. And that is why we're engaging in all these initiatives. I will leave it there for now. Thank you.
Yeah. Can I have a quick follow-up question? You mentioned partnerships, and I think a lot of people in the room here, believe in, obviously, in partnerships where each side brings their expertise to the table, and then the result is better. But we also know that partnerships sometimes are really hard to manage, especially when we think of the researchers community and organization where we're working on different timelines. We have maybe different incentives. So maybe if you can reflect on what can be, how you're thinking about this, and how can we design these partnerships in a way that will maximize the good and minimize some of the challenges that come maybe from the fact that there's a misalignment of interests and timeline. It's interest, and sometimes it's time frames. Right?
Sure. It's an excellent question. Actually, I think this is a problem that can be stated in many other dimensions, but in this specific case, you have some tensions, and I would say tensions not in a negative way, but I think tensions in the sense of conflicting objectives. So one tension could be, for example, precisely what we just said, between humanitarian versus development. The type of data that you need to collect is different if your interventions are aimed at having more, humanitarian, quick response interventions versus a more, longer term kind of intervention. I quote Achim Steiner from UNDP, who says humanitarian is about emergency response and development is about context and future, right? So you need different type of data. So that's one tension. The other is a very valid and legitimate tension between academics and practitioners, because academics want to have a specific type of time frames because they need to do rigorous research, whereas people need sometimes to have quick information to try to respond in policy. The other is also, and I would say in that sense, for example, the current negotiations the World Bank are doing with the IDA, the new IDA replenishment, that's a great example of partnerships, actually. And that is the type of instruments that could, in my opinion, try to reduce those tensions. Because if you have a longer term perspective, this issue, particularly in this case, forcibly displaced populations, as a global issue, as a global responsibility, then you create the conditions for longer-term financing, multi-donor, that encourages that the interventions are also, with a coalition of institutions. And that can open the space for questions that have to do with rapid response, with longer-term thinking, and with these concerns about what is the kind of data that you need. But the key partners at the end, and with this I close, have to be the governments themselves. So something we have seen is that if the governments do not internalize the need to have this as in their own interest, it is very difficult for the international community to maintain the momentum. So I think governments themselves have to be the main partners, and within the governments, I would argue, the national statistical offices are key.
Great, thank you so much, Elizabeth. My next question is for you. But feel free also if you want to follow up on anything that we heard from Luis Felipe. So you do protection, right? And obviously protection is key to the UNHCR mandate. But that also means that we need to advance policies and programs that protect the needs of a forcibly displaced population. And the question that I want to ask you is, to what extent you think new data sources and new research or research evidence can inform UNHCR when it's implementing its protection mandate? And, following on that, have you seen an evolution in the way UNHCR incorporates new data sources and new research and research lessons into its protection activities?
There we go. No, thanks for the question. So I've worked for UNHCR both in the field and now in headquarters. And indeed, first of all, I'll say yes to the question of, is there an evolution? Yes, thankfully. But also, I think we're getting better and we're looking at data in a more sophisticated manner. I will go back to some of what was discussed by the two earlier speakers, which is that for practitioners, the amount of data can be overwhelming. Where to look, which is, really going to help us to answer some of the difficult policy choices that we need to make, but also how do we use data in our advocacy, whether it's with host governments, whether it's on prioritizing programming for IDPs and convincing national governments of the specific needs of IDPs, or our donors, of course. And then I would say the third component to this complexity that we deal with is that we don't work alone. Even although UNHCR has a mandate for refugees, there are many other actors that we work with that are key to the humanitarian delivery. And then lastly, very much, we are moving, and that's certainly an evolution that's been happening over quite some years now. It's not just the humanitarian outcomes that we're looking for. Clearly, that's essential in large emergencies, any emergency to save lives, which requires speed and which requires often ready-made solutions, but that's not what's going to make a difference in the longer term. And so I think that move towards seeing things in a holistic manner, looking at socioeconomic data, not just of vulnerabilities of refugees and IDPs and stateless, but of the community that they're now hosted in. And this morning we heard some very interesting research, and I think that is very enriching for UNHCR's work, and has helped us also to engage with development partners and to kind of not see things in such a development humanitarian split way. This is a continuum, and we need to be looking at the development side from the beginning, because it's now very rare that displacement situations resolve themselves in a year, 2 years. So I'd start with that, and then just say that from the protection side, probably the data is important to us in terms of influencing law and policy. And again, the examples that we've heard this morning, I think, really show how we work in a complex environment. Voluntary repatriation is no longer it's no longer possible only where there is a clear peace agreement, where there are full guarantees for safety and inclusion and return to places of origin. And so we need better data on understanding what the impact of that is, intention surveys to see how people make decisions. That is a very complex decision-making process that people go through, and although UNHCR and other partners do intention surveys, having that more detailed and, if you like, more rigorous approach that research can provide for us, I think is very enriching. Similarly, when we're talking to donors, every humanitarian situation has needs, but how do we prioritize within that is another area where I think research can really help us, not just on vulnerabilities, but also on inclusion methodologies, and that is context specific. So even although global data on this is really important, and some of that we've heard this morning about how the impact of hosting refugees is not, it's not always negative, it's not always positive, you know, it's a mixed bag. But we do need that research on a more context-specific manner. So law and policy, but also concrete deliverables, protection interventions, what works, what doesn't work. There, it's often humanitarian agencies, and including through independent evaluations, that we get that information. But I think, for example, in the area of gender-based violence and what really works there and what doesn't, and where can we include particularly women and girls into national systems, and what are the barriers there. I think there are areas of research where, you know, it's difficult, it takes time, and it takes building trust with communities. So I wanted to mention, I can't remember now which piece of research it was, but the inclusion of refugees, local research organizations, so that idea of having the marketplaces is so excellent for that. You know, that the refugees themselves have a lot to offer in terms of the knowledge and the research that they can carry out. In fact, during the global consultation, the Global Refugee Forum last year, there was an event on for academics and researchers, and there was a large component of researchers from the Global South, including refugees and IDPs, and it was very interesting, the problems that they raised in terms of having their research recognized, the need for partnerships in order to get visibility and funding. So, and I think for us as practitioners, having that inclusion of refugee voices, IDP voices is extremely important. Maybe I'll just close by saying that, maybe giving a couple of examples. So certainly the evidence to support policy change often does come from research. It comes from arguments that need to be based, whether through the statistical offices and trying to get them to look at disaggregated data. So in Honduras and El Salvador, we did IDP profiling in order to get those two countries to adopt IDP policies. You know, it's not always evident to governments why they should adopt policies, and so in those two circumstances, research and surveys did help push that agenda forward. On the side of law and policy, so we've heard already a little bit about the DRAP project. We have in UNHCR also a rights mapping project, which is similar, but which has also a de facto component, which includes our protection monitoring. So what's there on the de jure side, the laws and policies are not necessarily what's implemented on the ground. And so I think putting those two together can often help us to move forward on policy changes that are required, and that needs to be based on data and on often something that comes from outside of UNHCR. We're seen as always fighting for the rights of refugees and IDPs, but if that's independent research, that often does, of course, help us. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I want to follow with it's less of a question and maybe more of a comment, and relates to the fact that you talked about the fact that there's a lot of data that is available, almost too much like data, even though we always like apply for grants to collect like more data. But it's related also to partnerships between organizations and researchers. And just to give an example of, and the thing that I wanted to throw into the discussion is something that is not sufficiently discussed, and this is legal bottlenecks that is hampering a lot of potential collaborations and fruitful collaboration. One example, you just showed us like a dashboard that we don't have access to because there's legal issues, and maybe we'll see that in a year. But I'll just give an example of we have a new project in South Sudan. There's a humanitarian crisis in South Sudan now, where we have not only the war didn't really finish, but we have South Sudanese that are coming back from Uganda. We have many Sudanese and South Sudanese coming from Sudan, given the war, right? And there's a lot of pressures there on some social cohesion. And UNHCR conducted a big survey in South Sudan, and we approached UNHCR. We're doing some work on social cohesion, and we wanted access to the survey in order to identify hotspots where the issues of social cohesion are most pertinent, and then they really wanted to work with us on this issue because they valued the collaboration, but then they couldn't share the data because there's privacy concerns. And then we're like, okay, we can de-identify the data, and then it got stuck in kind of legal, some legal bottleneck, and months and months and months later, we still couldn't move forward because we couldn't get access. So I think that's and again, I don't have a particular question here, but I think that just when we're thinking about these collaborations, streamlining also some legal bottlenecks, I think is probably a frontier that we don't discuss enough, but is important to think as we move forward with these types of collaborations. I don't know if any of you want to respond to that, or we can move to Rose.
I'll just say that I agree. I know the problems. I mean, within UNHCR, I think we do need to do better on having our data be more outward-facing and much sooner. So we have our colleague from, right at the back there, Volker, maybe during the you can say something about this, because it is important. We expect to be able to access data, but we do sit on very important data, and that is an ongoing process. I think there's a lot that's been done, but we can do more.
I'll put you on the great. So Rose, thanks for your patience. So you've worked extensively on knowledge translation with an eye towards fostering the use of research by policymakers, by practitioners, by NGOs, by civil society. And so my question to you is, based on your experience, other types of research that are more likely to be valued by policymakers and civil society groups, and if that is the case, what type of research? Related to that, if you can reflect on whether there's optimal strategies to increase the interest in nature in research productions, right? In research products. So it's like some communication strategies, I don't know, policy briefs, white papers that you think researchers should be using more if they're interested in being picked up by the policy making and practitioner and NGO community.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be here, to be on this panel. I hope you can hear me okay. And thank you for that question. So at the African Institute for Development Policy, AFIDEP, we work at the intersection of research and governments to support sustained use of data and evidence in decision making. And so my reflections on these are drawing very much from my day-to-day work at AFIDEP, based in Nairobi. Yeah, so in terms of the types of research that policymakers need, I think I would like to start by noting and just reflecting on the fact that policymakers will need different types of research at the different levels of the policy-making process, you know. And so if the issue is not on the agenda, and so you're trying to set the agenda, they will need evidence that shows them why that issue should be important, you know, or even the extent of that issue. If the issue is at the policy formulation stage, then they will also need different types of evidence. So thinking about evidence on what works to enable them choose the various policy options. And then if the issue is already being implemented and there are challenges, they will also need different types of data to be clear on how they improve implementation and service provision. And the same applies for the last stage of the policy-making process, which is evaluation. Again, they're looking mostly at impact types of evidence. And so I thought I should say that first, just so that I then comment from there. And so for researchers, it's always important for us to be very clear on where is our issue in the policy-making cycle. Are we at implementation stage, or are we trying to make a case for this issue, for policymakers to pay attention to this issue? Now, coming back to the question of what types of evidence then, do policymakers need more? And I'll draw more from my own experience working with policymakers. These are people in government, people in parliaments, and even in government, it's at different levels. Some are the national level, some are the subnational level, where they are involved in direct service provision. Some of the evidences that I've seen policymakers really need evidence around what works, and I know one of the panelists has talked about that in terms of demonstrating to them which are these interventions that work. And those evidences often will come from synthesis of a wide range of evidence, not necessarily from one study or one project. They find that very valuable, just so that they are able to make the case of why specific interventions are working and others are not working. Again, one of the panelists talked about context specific. So at AFIDEP, we do quite a lot of synthesis of evidence, drawing lessons from different parts of the world, different contexts in the African region. There's always the issue of, does this speak to our context? You know, and so is the data coming out of our context? Do we know how the different stakeholders will react to this intervention? And so the issue of policymakers needing evidence that is very context specific is very critical, and we keep being asked that question all the time. The other one is the issue around cost. So for researchers, we often come to policymakers talking about this intervention is better than this one because of ABCD. Some of the questions we are often asked is, so how much does it cost? You know, so you are asking us to change this policy or to change this intervention, to change this program, how much will it cost? So evidence around costing of interventions, but also even issues around cost benefit analysis. You know, why should we take this and not that one? And also evidence around improving the systems of delivery. So if you think about health services, policymakers often are very keen on evidence around how do we improve service delivery to different communities. Sometimes these types of evidence are not there, you know, because some of them need to also be coming from data from administrative systems that governments have a lot of it, but often that data is not being analyzed, is not being synthesized to provide insights that inform the decisions they need to make. Moving on the issue of strategies, you know, so strategies that can enable more uptake of research evidence in decision making. I just reflect on a couple, and of course, this also adds on what the other panelists have talked about. So one important strategy is really the issue of co-production of research evidence to ensure, and co-production, I mean that researchers are not producing evidence on their own and then taking it, to the policymakers and saying, here it is, use it. But rather, we are starting to ask our research questions together with the people who are going to use the evidence. So if they're policymakers, they need to be on the table so that we are co-producing the research, which would mean that then the research is responsive to their needs. It also aligns with the various decision-making cycles. We've had experiences where you're presenting research to people in government and they tell you, we wish we had this research 2 months ago because we were just discussing our work plans and our budgets. And so this research could have fit within our cycle, within our work planning and budget making cycle. And so thinking about co-production means that we are generating research that is responsive to the questions policymakers are asking, to the priorities policymakers have about the specific issue, but also that we are producing it in line with the various decision-making cycles they have so that we don't miss an opportunity to inform budget allocations or getting issues into government work plans because the evidence is coming much, much later. And AFIDEP, we use this quite a lot. A lot of our research processes are research process that we do together with the various government agencies that we want to work with, so that we are defining research questions together and working along in the production of evidence, which means there's also ownership, there is buy-in, because they see that the evidence is actually addressing some of their priorities and the questions they're keen on. Of course, in addition to that, there are issues around actual support in providing technical assistance in the uptake of data in decision-making processes, in work planning processes. So we find ourselves again working a lot hand in hand with government teams that may be developing work plans, they may be developing budgets, and that really moves beyond the generation of research to now technical assistance in supporting the uptake of some of the evidence that is coming about. The other strategy that is important is also sustained engagement with the relevant people in government, so high-level engagement, so that we are not just pushing evidence to them, but we are also providing opportunity to discuss this evidence, and not one-off, but evidence in a sustained way. And some of the things we've done for us is also to ensure that we are discussing this within their own decision-making processes. So many of us here will know that government have all these, technical working groups, task forces, and so feeding this evidence within those processes means that it's speaking to some of the issues that they're discussing within their decision-making processes. Of course, importantly, packaging the evidence. A lot of people do policy briefs, infographics. Again, a lot of policymakers find those quite useful for them to quickly pick out the things they need for decision making. I liked the online platforms that were being talked about here earlier as some of the opportunities for ready access. The issue of timeliness for research and data is always very key. And so having platforms where policymakers can click a button and find the information they need becomes very, very critical in packaging and supporting the translation of evidence in decision making. Of course, finally, on strategies is also the issue of just engaging other accountability actors. As researchers, we found that, yes, we can co-produce with policymakers, we can engage and support through technical assistance to support the use of data. But there are other actors like media, civil society, who are engaging in terms of accountability, looking at how budgets are being spent, looking at how various policies are being implemented. Working with those groups to ensure that they understand what the research is showing, the evidence, and they integrate that in their advocacy has proven very important to us and as an important driver of change, because sometimes political leaders, policymakers and political leaders will listen a lot to what is coming out of media, what is coming out of CSOs. And so getting evidence and data into the campaigns of these groups becomes very important in ensuring that some of these issues are critical and are issues that policymakers are paying attention to. So I will, I think, stop there in responding to this, and happy to, follow up on any specific questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rose. I'll follow up with a question that I'll ask you to answer first, and then I'll ask our other panelists to reflect as well. This was extremely insightful, but I want to go into specific examples. I think that might be helpful for our crowd. So if you can maybe share an example of a successful case in which research fed into a decision-making process that that you would like to share with us, especially with an eye towards reflecting on how that might be applicable to the forced displacement space. So again, an example of policymaking making use of research in a way that it was quite effective. It could be in the forced displacement, maybe not, but at least if we can reflect also on what lessons that can teach us for what will be a successful integration of knowledge into the forced displacement space. So we're going to start with you, Rose, and then Elizabeth, and then Luis Felipe.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So I'll just share one example. So one of the work that we've done over the years as AFIDEP, and sorry, this will not necessarily touch on forced displacement because that's a space where we haven't implemented a lot of work, but I think it's an example that can just help me also provide some lessons, is work that we have implemented over the years on looking at the changing population structure, the demographics for Africa, and how those then should inform how governments on the continent are planning and investing in the different sectors. And this is the work, of course, the demographers call it demographic dividend. So work on harnessing the demographic dividend for the continent, particularly looking at how the population on the continent is very young. And so how should our governments be investing to harness that for economic growth? So we started this work in terms of doing analysis. We started just doing analysis to help governments understand, one, how their demographics are going to be changing over the next 50 years for different countries on the continent, but importantly, what those demographics then mean, for decision making in terms of different sectors, education, health, as important sectors that could drive economic growth. And so that work, we started off doing those analyses at the continental level, so working with relevant officers at the African Union. And out of those analyses, and of course, sustained engagement over several years, actually working also in partnership with the UNFPA, which is one of the UN agencies, that produced commitment at the African Union that then informed African Union's roadmap on harnessing the demographic dividend in 2017. And so that roadmap was directly informed by lots of analysis that AFIDEP had been doing and engagements with a wide range of partners. And then moving out of that, then we zeroed in on analysis for specific countries, helping countries understand how their populations are going to be changing over the years, but also what those then means for investments for the different sectors, be it job creation, education, health. And those resulted in several countries, actually 10 plus countries, integrating that evidence into their medium plans. Some of these countries were like Zambia, Botswana, Kenya. They integrate that evidence into their medium plans in terms of putting the changing population structures at the center of their planning, so that is a component of their medium plans. And actually, Botswana moved forward to put in place a program of work now to implement some of the options they put in their national plan for them to be able to harness the demographic dividend for the country. And that is an example that we were the research partner who was focused very much on the analysis. And I think moving on to think of the lessons. So for us there, it was really the partnership. So we weren't doing these analyses like sitting here at AFIDEP and doing them and then taking them to government. We were defining what is needed, the analysis together with the relevant government agencies. Mostly working with the planning departments in the government. Of course, often some of these will be in the Ministry of Economic Planning, and some of them will be separate, but we were working with them. We also worked with local actors because the work was going on in many countries. So we also worked with researchers and academia in different countries, but it was really the relations, the co-production, ensuring that we are setting up analysis and assumptions that speak to governments, the context within the different governments. And I think the whole issue of ownership and buy-in and the fact that this was engaged at that high level with relevant government bodies that made the uptake of the evidence very, very easy. So we actually didn't have to now go back and convince them to use it because we are producing with them. It quite easily then evidence quite easily trickled into their national planning, national plans for several countries across the region. So that's what I can share quickly here. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Rose. So to you, Elizabeth, and I want to make sure we're going to have also time for Q&A, so let's try to keep it short, like one example, crisp, and then we'll open it to the floor. Thanks.
I'll try and keep it quick. I'd like to share two examples from Kenya. One is for the Shonda community. They were a stateless community in Kenya, and together with the government of Kenya, in fact, the National Statistical Bureau and the World Bank, there was a socioeconomic study of this community, and it showed important information about how, although that community was employed, they were mostly employed in the informal sector. And although children went to school, there was a high dropout rate in high school. And the poverty levels were higher amongst this community than their neighbors who were not stateless. And this actually resulted in this community being granted statelessness, nationality, Kenyan nationality in 2020, 2022, during that period. And that research was done in 2019, but it was together with the government through a government trusted institution. So just to say that those partnerships, which Rose also spoke to, are extremely important. The other one was also discussed this morning, the Sharika plan. It's not just one piece of research, but one thing that was done in Kakuma was, again, with the World Bank, a study on how the private sector would engage more in Kakuma camp. And so all of these things combined gives evidence to the government. Again, the government was involved, and most importantly, the private sector in Kenya was involved in that. And it resulted in more private sector involvement in Kakuma camp. And of course, for that to happen, it requires policy changes. So just to say that, you know, these examples, it can result in real change. I think working with government, working with the private sector, these are things that we at UNHCR are learning, and which partnerships are essential for that.
Great examples. So on to you, Luis Felipe.
Thank you. So first general point, and I will be brief so we can have Q&A. One general point is that following, convincingly the chain from research to policy is very important, but not always possible, but it is important. And I want to say that data and research influence policy indirectly, even when we cannot track that influence. So, and I would argue, for example, the World Bank 2 years ago, one of the lead authors is here, Toan, published the World Development Report on Migration. So that proposes a way to think about many of these issues. And I'm sure many people have been influenced by that, even if we cannot track it. Having said that, and more than research, I will talk about data. Two very important examples. One is in Colombia. JDC conducted a Pulso de la Migración, a very important survey a few years ago. And that led into very concretely into concrete actions by the government in the 10-year plan to integrate the Venezuelan migrants in Colombia. Very clear link between data and policy decisions. And that also fed into 3 policy financing operations of the World Bank, large operations. So that is a very clear example where this data really improve the quality of a specific intervention. So I want to highlight that one. The second, in Yemen, the high-frequency phone survey led to what was called the Emergency Human Capital Project, which was a $300 million project in Yemen to support human capital interventions, and that was informed by this high-frequency phone survey. So I think these are 2 very clear examples where the data directly impacted very concrete and important interventions.
So we have some time for Q&A. This panel was supposed to be 75 minutes, and now we're exactly in the 60 minutes. So I don't know what the organizers are thinking there, but we're going to make sure that we have some time for Q&A. Yes, Sandra. Yeah, and maybe we'll collect 2-3 questions. So if people want to signal.
So thank you so much for the interesting panel. My question is for Luis Felipe. No, both the World Bank and UNHCR. I would like to know from the, let's say, side of researchers, it would be so fantastic for us to hear from you about what are good ways of communicating with you more effectively in what we produce, so that it is of more used effectively in your day-to-day operation.
Great. We're going to collect a few more. Volker, do you want to reflect? There were some questions. Maybe you can reflect about like data availability.
Yeah, exactly. I just wanted to come back to the earlier mention and offer a few thoughts. First of all, we are on a fairly recent journey to do a lot better. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting there. And I need to ask you for a bit of patience while we're also having to be a bit more responsive to you. I'll come to that second part in a moment. Just to give you a quick example of a recent interest in a particular data set that needed augmentation for a specific bit of research. It was something that was brought up with our colleagues in the relevant country, in the relevant operation. And in fairness to our teams on the ground, they are very busy. And if it's not something they can slot into their work easily, it's a big ask. So that there is a natural limitation to what can be done up on request. And you know this from your interactions. You've been successful in your cases, but there's also many examples where unfortunately it just is not possible because of lack of cycles or resources, grosso modo. Now, that's the caveat. The thing that we need to be able to have better reflexes on as UNHCR is to say not everything is subject to a big complicated agreement on data sharing, but we can anonymize data. We have already several years ago not only taken the technology but also the standards and made them our own from the World Bank on data anonymization and have stood up the microdata library. Many of you have used it. And it's something that we continue to invest in. We have 845, I just checked, data sets there today. And we have a team of curators, and we will continue to grow that gradually and without a plan to make any changes on this journey. Now, I also came to learn during the days here, Guy, about some of the projects that are stuck. Research projects for lack of data, and I'm trying to pinpoint them individually, see what we can do. In many cases, it's also something that we are happy to help by unsticking contortions that some of our teams might find themselves in because they're not exactly sure what the easy path is. So I also invite you through contacts on the microdata library or through connecting with us here to take that shortcut, because we certainly value this community and the synergies that we see between the data we bring and the analysis and insights that you develop from there. So if there's specific points that beyond the one that I was made aware of, Guy, that others of you have, then please come and find us in a break or after the end of today, just to better understand where the pain points are, and we'll explore what we can do about it. Because of the aforementioned limitations, I'm not going to promise guaranteed delivery, but we want to make this easier all around. Lastly, if any of you have data sets that you would like to publish yourselves were also, of course, available. We have many partners who use who are at least interested. The usage is still emerging, but who are interested in publishing through our microdata site, which is also connected to others. So that's also an offer for those of you who would like to gain a bit more visibility on data work that you've done yourselves. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to add a few moments, and please come and see us afterwards.
Great. Yeah, I'm going to follow up on the last one. I think there's a lot of us in the room that has collected a lot of data, and we publish our papers and we put replication files, but because it's not, the library that you mentioned, things are cataloged in a way that are easy to find, right? And so we feel that we are being transparent by putting things on, making our replication files, but they're not really available to the public because they need to go into our websites and whatnot. And so I think it's a call for researchers as well to reach out to some of the aggregation databases that are cataloged much better than what we can do ourselves. And so thanks, Volker, for mentioning that. And maybe we have time for another one or two questions, and then we'll go back to our panelists. Yes, Tuan. And also the people online, if there's questions online, we would love to hear your voice as well.
Yeah, thank you for your intervention. I have another question, which is another big provider of data, collector of data is WFP. So do you think there is any authorizing environment appetite for doing the same type of initiative that is happening between the bank and UNHCR to give public access to the data that they are collecting?
I would love that.
Could I take that on the go?
Yep. Go ahead, Mike.
No, just in response to Toan, and it's not a full response, but it's just to say that we had great success in the Joint Data Center collaborating with Volker and Tarek, who also sits next to him, the chief statistician of UNHCR, on creating this microdata library, also very closely collaborating with the World Bank. And that was, that still constitutes one of the great examples to opening up other organizations' data sets through microdata libraries or links. And I think, we've had an ongoing conversation with the WFP about this, which is sort of on and off, but we really try and stimulate this with the argument that if an organization like UNHCR with such a sensitive protection mandate can open up its data to the world, surely everybody else can as well. And we had the High Commissioner say that to the world as well at one point. Thank you.
Amen. Maybe last question before we go back to the panelists. Okay, so as people are mulling, maybe possible other questions, I invite the panelists to maybe respond to some of the questions.
Talk about this communications issue. Briefly, but I think it's fundamental, because if you are going to influence any decision making, you need to make sure that whatever the findings we have there get to the right decision makers. So I think it's important to have not very, very rigorous, but a little bit of a theory of change when we think about communication. So who are the actors involved? Who are the most influential actors? What is your audience, right? So within the bank, certainly in our group, in our practice, we always think about our poverty assessments, our global reports, really to think about, I actually multiply by -1, a very popular statement, and I tell the people, very nice data, now tell me the story. And we economists are really bad at telling stories. I did this exercise, and we always talk about methodology. Well, we can talk about that for a long time. But the thing is, we have to be better at telling stories, but also knowing to whom we want to speak, right? So you need to have a little bit of that theory of change and understanding who are the actors you want to influence, and what are the messages, how you can, frame the messages to get to them. And that's something that we typically don't do very, very well. So we have to insist that we, as institutions that want to influence policy, have to be much better at communicating. Our teams are used to writing a report or a paper saying this is a very nice finding, go to what we call dissemination, which is basically going to talk to your friends to whom you always talk, present your paper, they tell you are super smart, and that's it, right? So we need to see how we use that research to really talk to the right audiences and so on. Just one point on that. So that would be for me the idea. So we have to get better at that. But one point I want to make is something that can really change, can be a game changer. For example, watching the inauguration of the Olympics and seeing Filippo Grandi there talking about refugees and the that kind of thing can have a huge impact. So this is the kind of things that were super cleverly, thought through to have really impact in the way people approach these issues and so on. So I think on one hand, thinking more about the value change from findings to influence, but on the other, having an idea of how these big ideas or big events that can change the way people think about certain issues.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Maybe final thoughts?
I don't know exactly how to answer your question about how to better, be in touch with UNHCR, make sure that, or find ways in which your research can impact policy. I don't have a straightforward answer. First of all, I will say that, I was very happy I wasn't here yesterday, sorry, but this morning, there is a lot of data around Kenya, Ethiopia. There's not so much around the CAR, Niger. And so I think in some ways, that's one entry point, because the UNHCR offices there, the IOM offices, WFP will be more open to talking to you because there is a dearth of data. Secondly is, I don't know, but probably partnerships with research institutes in the region who have access to government. I insist that, in a way, it's not just about influencing UNHCR. Yes, our policies are important too, but ultimately it's the policies of governments who have forcibly displaced in their territory or stateless communities. And and then the third one is, of course, the people themselves. And I think, yeah, I mean, so far I have that example of Kakuma where we have some researchers and people who have been resettled out of Kakuma who come back and who know the people, who know the local community, who know the local authorities. So I think maybe those are just some thoughts. I don't think it's an easy thing. And then maybe the other thing is, and I don't know if you can speak to this, that we have in UNHCR a number of academic kind of coalitions. I've forgotten what it is. GAIN? I've forgotten. Who can speak to that from you? Yeah, maybe you could say something about that. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elizabeth. And maybe Rose, final words?
Thank you. So I'll just say two things. One is that the funders of research also have a big role to play in ensuring that researchers generate research that is needed, that speaks to government priorities. And so I think thinking about how groups that are funding research on forced displacement need to push researchers to design research that is being designed in partnership with the policymakers who are expected to use that evidence. So that's really important. But also, secondly, just my final thought is that researchers and policymakers, we are all trying to address the same problem, improving people's lives. We realize that by working together and not working in silos. I know it's easy to work in silos. it's better to work together in designing our research for it to respond to urgent problems that will really be able to improve people's lives. Thank you. Over.
Yeah, amen to that as well. Join me, everyone, in thanking our great panelists.